I went to the front lines of the war in Ukraine, but to be more precise, I actually went to the front lines inside Russia, because I crossed over the international border into the Kursk incursion, which is one of the most dangerous 800 square kilometers in the world. We're in Kursk right now, in Russia. This is also where over 10,000 North Korean soldiers are stationed, some 40,000 Russian soldiers. This is the direction where Americans just recently approved ATACMS missiles to be fired here. If you're not aware, in August 2024, Ukraine shocked the world with a surprise invasion where they captured a chunk of Russian territory that they've been battling to hold on to ever since. The stakes couldn't be higher for Ukrainian forces, who are hoping to use this land as a bargaining chip in future peace negotiations. Meanwhile, Russia's throwing everything they have at them to deprive them of this leverage. Ukrainian forces have withdrawn from roughly 40% of the territory that they once held in August, from 1,250 kilometers down to about 800 kilometers today. My mission is to speak directly with Ukrainian soldiers to find out what it's really like to operate deep inside enemy territory, to interview Russian civilians who are now grappling with the shocking reality of the conflict arriving at their own doorstep. How has the Ukrainian military treated you? We'll also hear from a high-ranking Ukrainian government official about the geopolitics of the war, and to find out with my own two eyes what's really happening on the ground. If this is your first time watching the channel, welcome. My name is Chris Cappy. I'm your average infantryman. I was a lower enlisted, regular old 19-year-old grunt in the US Army when I deployed to Iraq. This is my first time back in a war zone in over 15 years. On a personal level, this report is kind of my attempt to find closure with my own complicated relationship with war, which left me questioning my role in the conflict. So while I've been away in Ukraine, my team and I still manage to post a new video each week, and the only way I could accomplish this is thanks to Odoo, which is the best all-in-one business management software. It's a must-have for any upstart entrepreneur who's trying to build out a small business while juggling a million different things. Odoo helped me tackle tons of dry, menial managerial tasks like dealing with expenses and reporting while I was away. All the stuff that takes valuable time away from the creative part of YouTube that I love doing. Odoo does this by using their suite of more than 45 easy-to-use applications that touch on everything from invoicing and sales to inventory and website creation. It uses built-in features like AI integration and Smart Button, which is my favorite feature. It lets you gain quick insights without having to navigate away from your current view. And the best part is you get your first Odoo application for free for life. That includes hosting and support, and I can confirm that once you see how much time Odoo saves you, you'll want to get more and to make your job even easier. If you want to supercharge your productivity so you can focus on the parts of your business that you love, click the link in the description or the pinned comment below the video to create your free database today. Even just my journey to Russia was eye-opening to me, in terms of the logistics and just seeing how the sausage is made. We met early in the morning on the side of the road in the closest Ukrainian city of Sumy. We would travel in a Canadian-provided Senator armored vehicle, which was a blessing and a curse at the same time because it's more protected, but anything worth more than like $15,000 is a magnet for explosive drone attacks, or so I'm told.
Броньована техніка в цільному ряду.
Armored vehicles are number one aim.
High value target.
Yeah. So the most dangerous part of the route between the border control point and the Sucha, because the road is under enemy gun control and FPV range.
The operation that they have here is insane. Just seeing the amount of material and manpower that they're pumping into this region is very impressive. From what I observed, is that for as far as the eye can see, logistics trucks carrying fuel, water, food, ammunition, and troops into the fight 24/7 day and night. I was surprised to see that about 70% of the logistics vehicles I observed in the Kursk direction are a hodgepodge of repurposed civilian cars and trucks. They often repainted them matte green and slapped a few triangle symbols onto them to show that they're military related. We drove from Sumy towards Kursk, which is roughly 60 kilometers away. We set off along the same exact supply route that sustains troops at the front. There is only one way in and out of Kursk, and there's a choke point that's been zeroed in by Russian artillery fire.
The enemy made more than 13,000 shells in this area, so this is the statistic.
Керованих авіабомб КАП. Да, хлопці заникали вже трохи старанні.
So we're crossing over into the Russian territory now?
Yeah. Already Russian territory.
We just crossed the border into Russian territory. We're in Kursk now. And this is, I think, one of the more dangerous parts of the trip, going to Suja. We were now well within Russian artillery and FPV drone range, and this section, this choke point, entering their country was a main target for strikes. This is my first time in Russia. Probably one of my last times in Russia, because I don't think that they're going to let me into Moscow after this. I was warned by Ukrainian officials that by choosing to report from inside Russian territory, I'd now be put on a list by the Kremlin and potentially arrested if I ever traveled to a country that's friendly to them. I was advised to not go to Venezuela or Uzbekistan anytime soon. This was an intimidation tactic to make journalists think twice about drawing attention to a part of the war that's seen as kind of embarrassing for Russia.
So here we should be very fast.
Are we getting out now?
Yeah. Let's open one.
Okay. Nice to meet you. The artillery fire is very close. Their position's got to be within 50 meters of here. I could see how the Russian civilians were desensitized to violence. They didn't even react to the artillery rounds. Although I'll admit I was a little bit rusty and it did scare the fuck out of me.
Can I ask you, do you have everything you need? Do you have food? Do you have water?
Medicines are needed. My wife is diabetic. She needs medicine. Well, there is food left. We bring water from the well.
Yeah, they have food, they have water.
How has the Ukrainian military treated you?
It's normal. The guys are normal. Well, they don't touch us.
Now everything is fine. The guys are not aggressive.
Pay close attention to what the Russian civilians' reaction is to this explosive drone flying overhead.
Это я говорила. Я тебе говорила, еще когда я давала интервью,
Is that friendly or enemy?
говорила я тебе.
They're not even fazed by it. While we were speaking with the Russian civilians, I could hear Grad rockets impacting a couple hundred meters away. Just an everyday reality they live with here.
How much aid did Russia bring? How much insulin did Putin give you? How many candles, matches? How much did he give you?
I'm telling you again, if Russia would come here, it would provide assistance. But Russia is not here.
So aviation bombs, I think the CAB 500 or one of those aerial bombs came through here and just blew up a number of these buildings. Russian aviation bombs did this to their own residential areas here in Kursk. The night before, a Russian jet had dropped several Fab 250 bombs here, devices with an explosive weight of 100 kilograms, capable of leveling light fortifications within a 120-meter radius. Standing amidst the devastation, I could see the grim accuracy of those numbers. Buildings are still on fire from last night. After the bombs hit, one of them landed right in the middle of the street. This area you can't really even go through here. Russian CAB 500, Fab. 3 of them. I gathered that the point the Ukrainian officials were trying to make was pretty clear. Russia indiscriminately bombs and destroys their own towns. However, I'd been on other parts of the front line and seen Ukrainian artillery and drones destroy their own homes, Ukrainian homes, in territory occupied by Russia, so that point didn't really resonate with me.
Фактично кожного дня, але залежить від погоди.
These bombs can be dropped from 80 kilometers away, almost outside air defense range, and then drones can do instant battle damage assessment. When I deployed to Iraq, I never once had to worry about an enemy plane dropping bombs on me. I understood just for a second what it must have been like to fight against me in Iraq. We were in Suja, about 1.5 miles from the closest Russian infantry positions. We were surrounded on all 3 sides. Everywhere you looked out in the distance was Russian positions. I'm here with the 47th Brigade. We're at where they've left their vehicles before going into battle in Kursk, and we're going to talk with them about some of their operations, how they run missions, lessons that they've learned, and just try to get as much insight from them as possible. I can't say where we are. I can't even hint at it. We're going to blur out this location because this is where they infill to Kursk from, but we can say that this is where they come to do some routine repairs in between missions. What type of targets are you facing mostly? Is it infantry or vehicles?
Dugouts. We're facing everything in large numbers. It depends on the task. BTR or BMPs are driving at us. It's not a problem for us at all. They send their punished ones, or cannon fodder. Shoot 15 fucking times at them, and that's it. There's no enemy vehicle anymore. Guaranteed annihilation.
This combat footage of them in Kursk shows why the Bradley has become the most famous vehicle in this war. They're laying down suppressive fire with the 25mm high explosive cannon rounds, and then they pop smoke when they get out of the tree line into the open so that they can't get hit by enemy anti-tank teams. Do they use hunter-killer tactics where one is searching for targets and the other is hitting them?
We don't have that. We just have an option when we can work in pairs of 2 vehicles in tandem, or 3 vehicles. For example, we've worked in pairs with the tanks. It's just that whoever goes first, in any case, if he notices where shots are coming from, well, the one behind already starts shooting.
The commander, Alexei, told me that one of the most important aspects is teamwork, and that him and his gunner, Valery, can almost read each other's minds. They have that level of unity. We see them working alongside an American M1 Abrams tank inside Russia here. This is a textbook assault tactic, covering down on one another and choosing the best weapon system for each target. Despite this, and despite the fact that the Bradley is beloved here, it's still very old technology. A lot of the systems they're using are still from the 1980s, and they're missing some key features like the Commander Independent Viewer that can point out targets as they go. They use their own navigation map system for marking enemies on a separate tablet screen instead of the United States electronics.
Watch your foot while walking, and the asphalt is your best friend.
Watch your foot because there could be mines?
Yes, like remote mining, something like node exploded.
Do they think that the war is going well for Russia? Do they know that they've lost thousands of tanks?
No, they don't know details at all. The only thing they know is that Russia is liberating Ukraine. But we faced here that people are very afraid of talking what they really think. You could be punished in Russia.
The Ukrainian infantrymen that I spoke to didn't paint a rosy picture either. They were very honest and direct about how dire the situation was on the front and how they were losing territory and that the conditions right now are certainly not in their favor. Can you ask them, are they happy to hear that the ATACMS was approved?
We are happy about their slavery, but we appreciate at least that we have this.
The news everyone was talking about that morning was the approval of American and British long-range missile systems like the ATACMS and Storm Shadow with ranges of around 300 kilometers. I felt like I was now walking into the hornet's nest that was about to be kicked. That morning, as I was on the ground, Ukrainian forces launched a precision strike using Western-supplied long-range missiles into Kursk. 12 British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles flew over our heads. They were launched from 6 of Ukraine's Su-27s. These missiles hit targets 30 kilometers north of me. They targeted a Russian command outpost located in the town of Marino. The strikes injured a North Korean general, killed 18 Russian soldiers, and wounded another 30. The Ukrainian military claimed that these strikes killed 500 North Koreans, but I have not seen this claim independently verified.
How do they feel about the North Koreans over here?
They will be fertilizer for Ukrainian soil.
Through United 24 Media, I was able to speak with the head of the office of the Ukrainian president, Mikhail Podolak. He was famously one of the representatives of Ukraine at the initial negotiations with Russia.
Did that surprise you when you learned that North Korean soldiers were going there? What implications do you think that has for the wider war?
We're simultaneously fighting against Iran, which is providing material help to Russia, against North Korea, which is providing material and manpower support to Russia and against Russia, with all of its military complex. So if our partners will, after all, provide the necessary weapons and time, then we will come to a fantastic and just end to this war.
Later, Russian President Vladimir Putin would even confirm that the strikes had indeed hit a command outpost and killed Russians. American Providum ATACMS missiles would later fly and hit Kalino Air Base in Kursk, where the Russians were flying close air support from. Tatarigami did a great analysis of this on X, of these strikes and how ATACMS may not have hit many Russian aircraft because they'd already been moved away in the days and months prior, and new concrete construction was built here to protect them. Putin stated these missile strikes in Kursk were an escalation from the West that amounted to NATO directly entering the war. Meanwhile, the US government stated that this was in response to Russia's escalation of deploying North Korean troops.
But there are a lot of people who are fearful that that would escalate the war and bring it to potentially a nuclear war.
I'll explain to you the nature of Russian Mir, the Russian Federation. They always take the first step and then wait for your reaction. If you react the way democratic countries have, unfortunately, reacted, they raise the stakes. They raise them higher. Why? They're not ready to take it to the final level. They're not ready to use nuclear weapons. But they're prepared to bluff to get everything. They're ready to scare you.
On the ground in Kursk, all the political arguments and the decisions made by leadership couldn't be further from anyone's mind.
So we will work fastly because we have been detected somehow that we are here.
It's terrifying because their word that we got from the press officer is that they know where we are now. They're tracking us. Standing in the ruins, I was struck by an uncomfortable realization. I felt that I belonged here, witnessing something bigger than myself. I could feel now that I was on the frontier, the meeting point of two systems colliding. On the one side, in the east, Putin's authoritarian rule. On the other side, in the west, a society fighting for values that couldn't be more different. And from where I stood, it seemed that this fundamental difference could unfortunately only be resolved through violence. How do they deal, if they ever get afraid, how do they deal with that fear?
Every time I go out, it's scary. We do nothing to deal with it. We just go ahead. I crossed myself, prayed, and I go. I can't do anything about it, but when we return, I'm very happy. Before I went to battle duty, it was scary. Now it's not. Now I understand what adrenaline is. I understand what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for my homeland, for my family, so it's not scary anymore.
How soldiers handle fear is something that has always interested me, I guess because sometimes I have trouble myself dealing with being afraid. When I was 19 years old, it didn't occur to me the danger that I was in, but now at 35, I was all too aware of what I could lose. My wife back home, who was worried about me. But I felt like having this opportunity to tell people what is really happening in Ukraine, maybe it was a chance for me to do some good in ways that I wasn't able to when I was in uniform. So I'm curious. I'm curious how other people handle fear. One common theme that I've noticed in all of the answers is prayer, higher power, spirituality, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I found myself praying for the first time in years, if I'm being honest, and there is some truth to that saying. There are no atheists in foxholes. We're going and talking to different people, different homes, and we're dropping off things like insulin for people who have diabetes. Russia's saying that they're going through here, people destroying homes. They're claiming that they're not. That's part of the reason why they, I think, want an American journalist here, is because they want to get their side of the story out.
The highlights from the Russian news, where Russian public person, state person said that here in the center of the Sudzha, this is the concentrational camp, detaining center, where people are being tortured, killed.
Many of the guys I talked to, they said that they felt a need to enlist when their homeland was invaded by Russia. I think this powerful motivation partly explains why they've been able to hold back an adversary that outnumbers them sometimes 5-1. I expected to meet with a lot of poorly motivated and exhausted soldiers because they're now reaching the 1000th day of the war. But this was not what I saw. I saw disciplined, squared away soldiers. It's not like the Ukrainian military held their punches either. They didn't just show me parts of the front that are sunshine and rainbows and quiet. They brought me to the worst parts of the country where often they're losing. Their soldiers almost universally expressed to me that they were well aware of this reality, that they're losing ground, even that they're losing the war, and that the tactical picture for them isn't good. Despite this, almost all the regular average infantrymen that I spoke to expressed their desire to continue fighting. I can't imagine what it's like to be a soldier in an outnumbered force. One of the things that helps me deal with fear is just knowing the scale of how many people are there supporting you. They were resupplying an estimated 25,000 Ukrainian soldiers fighting into Kursk. For every combat soldier, you need to account for at least one more logistics soldier resupplying him. But I learned that logistics in this direction is complicated by a couple of factors you wouldn't realize unless you got on the ground. When I looked at the map online, it looks like a 1-hour straight easy shot to Kursk. But what the map doesn't reveal is how chewed up this road actually is. Once I got on the ground, I was surprised to see how tank treads, bombs, wear and tear had turned large sections of the road into giant potholes that slowed everything down to a crawl, and nearly doubles the amount of time it should take to get there. It adds to the cost of maintenance. Broken down cars with popped tires and destroyed suspension systems were a common sight. As we traveled, it struck me just how stretched these supply lines really are. Compared to other sections along the front that I'd seen already, Sumy is one of the furthest hubs from the point of contact. Keep in mind, much of the ammo also needs to take a 17-hour train ride from Poland to Kyiv, and then after that, another 4-hour truck drive to Sumy. All along this route, you hit checkpoints, and they get more and more frequent as you get further and further east. They were guarded by a number of troops who would check our identification. These are SBU officers who are experts in counter-espionage, looking for saboteurs from Russia here. They verified my press credentials, and they were also out there to stop deserters or different Ukrainians who are trying to avoid mobilization orders.
Yes.
Do you think that the information war is very important?
So yeah, it's super important because here we make the seeds of truth in the heads of these people. They will understand that Ukrainian boots, Ukrainian army here, just not to make Sumy city being shelled, and the people will really understand who started this war and how this war was started.
Does he blame Putin? Does he blame Ukraine for what's happening here?
I don't know who's blame. I'm not into politics.
As much as we would all like to avoid it, The reality is sometimes politics has an impact on what happens on the battlefield. Russian and North Korean troops appear to be aiming to push Ukrainian forces out by the end of January. There are claims that this has to do with the new incoming administration in America. But I was curious to know what Ukrainians think of this development.
Donald Trump just won the election in the United States. He is saying that he wants to end the war very quickly. How does Ukraine plan to navigate potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy?
I look at everything a tad optimistically, because I believe that Mr. Trump is a man who has a rational approach to assessing one phenomenon or another. Moreover, he is a person that always takes the initiative. He wants to be number one, which is quite cool, because you can't just come up and say, look, there's a scenario for freezing the conflict. There's a scenario of conceding something to Russia, because these scenarios show that Putin is number one. I can't imagine that Trump's ready to be number two after Putin. That would be odd. Why? Because Putin, in comparison to Trump, is a tiny midget.
That's a lot more 155 or whatever artillery shelling that they're sending out from tubed artillery over here. It's a lot more rounds than anywhere else on the front line that I've been in, and I've been all across the front line so far. So Kursk appears to be very much their main effort, I would say, based on what I've seen so far, because I've seen, without showing you the positions, I've seen Ukrainian infantry taking shelter in the houses around here. I believe we're only 2-3 kilometers from Russian positions.
The guys trusted me enough to show me this secret location where they live, referred to as the safe house. This was not how I pictured Ukrainian soldiers living. I pictured them like in the trenches 24/7 for some reason. Once off duty here, the guys can relax, cook food, and clean their weapons. It's not the Ritz-Carlton, but they even have access to internet through Starlink.
So they're a new team that they were teached by the previous team, and now they're already working at the front line, and they came to brigade like 2 months ago. They're doing 2 days shift, and then going back here.
I can't show you any of the exterior of this location, as you might have noticed. I blurred some parts of the screen out, and this is because Russian forces have used video footage like this and photos to geolocate the position, and then they add that location to their missile list for future strikes. Yes, that's right. Some people have hit lists, Russia has missile lists.
What are most of the weapons that the guys use? Is it mostly Western?
They only using it for this situation.
Oh. It's like a artillery battle mostly?
Yeah, it's like
Yeah. 25th Bushmaster.
What I can tell you about how the regular infantry live here is that they find an unassuming house, one that's been evacuated, and then they set up shop. This is actually true for both sides in the war, because the second you set up a traditional military base, like the one I lived in Iraq, you're asking for a missile straight to the teeth. You might as well raise a giant red flag that says, "Shoot me, please." The only way I was able to get access to this safe house and Kursk in the first place was thanks to United 24 Media, so I recommend you subscribe to their YouTube channel if you want to learn more about things like this. I was definitely not expecting to see soldiers even have the opportunity to head back to the city to spend time with their wives and family. That part shocked me. 1 minute you're taking artillery fire, and the next you're sitting down at a nice restaurant eating a gourmet meal with your loved ones, the very people you're trying to protect. I have to admit, I had this preconceived idea going into this, thinking that all the soldiers were on the zero line all the time, like 24/7. But I've since learned I couldn't have been more wrong. Oleksiy revealed to me that him and his team spend about 2 days on the front in combat before they're then rotated back to what's called a safe house. It's a one-on, one-off system, where one Bradley is deployed while the other is back at the safe house. They bring the infantry to the zero line, drop them off, provide fire support with the cannon while they're on the ground, and it's not like they're on the front for years on end. They're rotated off the front entirely. Battalions spend half a year running this routine, and then they're rotated off back to the rear for training and refit. What I'm talking about here is a very important military concept known as operational tempo or op tempo. It means the rate at which missions are conducted during a campaign. You have to balance speed with downtime in order to sustain and outpace the enemy. These variables are weighed like a seesaw, and if they aren't balanced right, then the tide of the battle can go poorly if you choose to rotate your guys not frequently enough. So for example, if you want to have 1,000 soldiers defending a section of the front in Kursk, you need to account for having another 1,000 to rotate them with, and then another 2,000 all the way in the rear to rotate them with every 6 months, and then another 2,000 to run logistics for them. The same considerations and limitations for missions is also true for Russian forces. These considerations are doubly important from the Russian perspective, especially operationally, because they're on the assault in Kursk for Russia.
So many journalists even can go here because their editor's policy is they can go out to the border without the permission. Some teams came and then changed the decision and asked that can you delete your footage you made? Like, we haven't been here.
We had to move quickly. Russian forces were now aware there was an American journalist in Kursk. Now, usually the way Russia figures this out and tracks this is they have these things called Orlan drones. The way I understand it is they're high-flying surveillance drones that can be hooked up with routers that then ping and crawl and download all your cell phone data. So if you have an American SIM card in your phone, the Russians will see that, pinpoint your location, and send a missile there. Nick from Battles and Beers told me to download an app that would let me change to a Ukrainian's eSIM card, and to use a VPN to avoid detection by the Russians. All Ukrainian soldiers and myself also put our phones on airplane mode once we got within 20 kilometers of the front to avoid being tracked and identified. You don't want 5 cell phone pings in one building drawing attention to the Russian military. No system is perfect, of course, but why make it easier for them to kill you? The Russian people seemed like they were unafraid of anything. They seemed like they were comfortable speaking freely in front of the Ukrainian officers. Here the Russian civilian is arguing that they're not getting the supplies that they need, and the Ukrainian press officer is saying, "You're lying, I was just here yesterday and I gave you my own supplies."
You're able to get them some supplies?
Yeah, and he will show the video her family member.
Дочка из России.
Family members from Russia.
Но последнее меня очень ужаснуло. На всех 3 видео ты плачешь и просишь.
The commander went around and he got a bunch of the civilians that live there and he put them in touch with their family members who are in other parts of Kursk, or they might be located in other parts of Russia, in Moscow, for instance. So he got them on FaceTime with them because there's no other way for them to reach their family members. I gave this Russian gentleman an American cigarette. Money here has no good, so cigs were all they wanted. War zones have a way of stripping life down to its raw essentials. In this barter economy, cigs have become a universal type of currency.
Do they operate as like a squad, as one squad, and they go to the positions and then they do they do fire support when they're at the positions, or do they operate more as like a taxi and they drop off the soldiers and then they leave?
When the weather permitted during the initial days, we would actually use Stryker to storm the enemy positions and do a suppressive fire, and during that time our ground troops could take up positions and cover and storm the enemy positions, and then the vehicles would leave. Also, we would bring troops to the positions, and we would bring ammunition and food. You could potentially use some more maneuverable vehicles, like a pickup truck, but shrapnel could do some damage to those, so we use Strykers in those situations.
I'm here with the 80th Airborne Brigade in the Kursk direction. They have the American-provided Stryker armored vehicles here with a Browning 50 caliber machine gun on top.
It's my first time back on a Stryker and since like 2015. Feels good to be back. They took off all the side armor, all the cage armor. They took off the explosive reactive armor because what would happen is they would hit into a tree and then that would explode.
I'm not forcing you to go anywhere. I'm offering you an option. You either agree or disagree. According to international humanitarian law, I have no right to force you. I'm offering you this option, that on the day of the evacuation, a car will come to pick you up here, and from here you will go straight to Sumy.
They say that they're providing opportunities for these people to evacuate if they want to, but it appears like the people that are here right now are the people that do not want to leave. They've written on each of the houses, they're letting people know that they're there and that they're civilians, hoping that the drones and the artillery will see those markings and not hit those buildings. It says here on the wall that their mom died and that they've moved to another location.
Communication in this war zone had devolved to the same age as the barter system. Private messages written onto public walls with the hopes that they would reach the intended eyes. Even navigating here is a challenge in ways I didn't expect. I found my GPS system on my phone was frequently jammed by the Ukrainian military. One moment you're looking at Google Maps, the next your location has been spoofed and you think you're 200 miles to the east, or the signal's completely down from friendly electronic warfare. But one thing working in Ukraine's favor is that the Russian military, from their perspective, they have to travel almost twice the distance, 120 kilometers, in order to truck supplies from their closest city of Kursk. However, both sides face a major challenge. There is really only one main 2-lane road that travels to the fight and back. This severely limits your options and creates a dangerous, vulnerable choke point for attacks. Both sides are funneled into predictable movements. Then, 2 Russian women suddenly walked past us crying. I followed them to their half-standing homes. What I saw there made me emotional in ways I hadn't been in years. The women told me they'd lived in this house for over 20 years. I couldn't imagine my entire life being suddenly destroyed in front of me like that. The destruction would now force them to abandon their homes in search of the communal shelter. It was very difficult for me to watch this old Russian woman pick up the remaining pieces of her life off the floor. I couldn't help but think of my own grandmother, who had survived some of the first aerial bombardments ever during the Spanish Civil War. 9 decades later, and the only thing that seemed to have changed was our proficiency. This was the first house in Russia that I had been inside, and what instantly struck me was the level of poverty, the smell of trash, and of people who didn't have running water for ages. According to 2023 information, the average monthly Russian salary is just 71,000 rubles, or about $750. The number of Russians who say they can't afford basic necessities has jumped from 30% to 50% in the past 2 years. More Russian soldiers have died from the poorest regions of Russia than anywhere else, according to stats compiled by Mediazona.
There's practically no standard of living in a lot of regions in Russia. There are no job opportunities, there's no income, families are poor, the people are poor, and so on. So you take a poor population that nobody cares about, that can't realize its potential, and you send them to war. There you can do whatever you want, kill, rape, and pillage this country. And people are going, firstly, to earn money they would never have made in Russia otherwise. Secondly, they can pillage Ukraine. And both Russia and North Korea are ready for war. But the modern world isn't.
And when Ukrainian soldiers are hit with these Russian assaults, there's one threat that all armored crews that I spoke to were unanimous in agreement that was their main concern.
What hit that?
FPV drone. Currently the scariest thing is the FPV. They are attached on this fiber optic cable. REBs, REBs, also known as electronic warfare devices, do not jam fiber optic. There are a lot of REBs. We have 6 of them. Each one is on its own wave, on their own frequency. They do their job.
You can see Russian FPV drones have struck many of the 47th Bradleys using cords that are tethered to it. These drones are typically armed with RPG munitions strapped to them for kamikaze runs, constantly circling above, always hunting them in a deadly game of cat and mouse. They reminded me of the improvised explosive devices I faced in Iraq, except now they'd evolved into a nightmare with wings. The gunner, Valerie, showed me a picture of a Russian 10-inch FPV explosive drone that landed on the vehicle near the driver's hatch, but luckily for them, didn't detonate.
Speaking of the FPV drones, how does the armor stand up to mines and FPV drones, the threats that they face here?
What we personally faced is FPV, but it didn't hit us directly. We got shrapnel from FPV, but we don't know what kind of explosives it had. It holds good against the mortar rounds and artillery if it hits somewhere about 10 meters from the striker. The armor does well with any shrapnel. The armor is good here. Even with regular rounds, the bullet gets destroyed in the first layer of the armor. First it goes ceramic, with rubber, then metal, and another layer on the inside, so the troops inside are very well protected. The worst problem we have is the drones. This gives us the worst headaches, the drones. Yes, we had an anti-tank guided missile hit us. We also get blown up by landmines, but it's mostly drones.
You can see on the top of the Bradley turret here, those things with circle domes on them are what's called EW, or electronic warfare devices. These jam a wide range of frequencies when activated, but they told me the jammers have pros and cons. I learned that if you jam low enough frequencies, you start to cut off your own radio communications, or you can disrupt the accuracy of friendly bombing systems that rely on GPS. Actively jamming drones can also make your location easier to track by the enemy.
The fiber optics they use now, we have no tool to counteract them. And often you leave the position, and there are already 12 of them, like a beehive under you.
Drones make defending Kursk incredibly difficult, but the terrain in this direction is also a challenge to be considered. This is what the zero line in Kursk looks like: shallow trenches, positions of just a handful of soldiers. There are lakes everywhere. When you try to dig deep into the earth, you hit water quickly. The soil's not great for digging into in this forested region. Roots get in the way of attempts to build trenches without any mechanized equipment.
What type of battles do you have in Kursk? How is Kursk different than some other places like Pokrovsk?
It was easier in Pokrovsk. It was, at first, our territory, roughly speaking. That area was all ours, so that's why it's way easier. The fighting is harder here because it's their territory, and they don't spare any ammunition for us. They spare no resources. Well, here's much harder. Well, it's harder than it was there.
Have you been using the TOW launcher? What can you tell me about that?
When it comes to the TOW missiles, we always have to have one. Well, we don't use bunker busters here. There's no need for it. And in Donetsk, we had one anti-tank missile and one anti-bunker missile.
The first thing that immediately stood out to me when I saw them was the insane amount of damage they'd survived. Entire pieces of armor had been ripped apart by direct hits. But this man, Oleksiy, has casually been shot too many times for him to even remember what hit him.
You can see they've taken all kinds of shrapnel and hits to the side of the vehicle, and that the paneling has protected them from.
This is partly thanks to this piece here called the Brat Dynamic Protection Armor Kit. These are like add-on modular tiles that you see surrounding the vehicle. When they're damaged, you can swap them out. It basically explodes outwards as soon as it's hit by incoming.
What other threats are they facing?
Mortars, artillery, Lancet drones. There's never been a time when a vehicle arrived and nothing flew in to get it. Everything is attacking this Bradley.
When you're in the muddy season in Ukraine and you need to get to a austere location, a remote spot where the enemy isn't going to be able to spot you from overhead with drones, and they're not going to be able to drop bombs on you.
Operating in these muddy conditions does come at a maintenance penalty, though. Sometimes the mud can destroy the tracks, requiring replacement.
How is the maintenance on the vehicle so far? Do you have all the parts that you need?
We don't have those maintenance things. If the machine can't move, the vehicle is then evacuated. It is taken back to the repair battalion. If we sent it in the evening, and if it wasn't really badly damaged, then they returned it to us in the morning.
The fast turnaround time is impressive and an indication of how much of Ukraine's resources are being devoted to the Kursk operation. The United States has gifted about 300 Bradleys to Ukraine. That's an estimated value of roughly $600 million. And the US Army has about 3,700 Bradleys in reserves and in total. Russian state media, the TASS news agency, and some private Telegram journalist channels were putting out information that Ukraine had set up a concentration camp in Kursk, so I went to check out what that was all about. According to the officer, at least 2,500 Russian civilians were left in the occupied part of Kursk, all of whom needed to be cared for. I learned here that the Russian civilians had no real accurate understanding of the war in Ukraine. They thought the Russian army had been invited into Ukraine in 2014, and that no Ukrainian cities had been experiencing heavy shelling or indiscriminate bombing. They had no idea that thousands of Russian tanks had already been destroyed. Ukrainian soldiers put up photographs of their destroyed towns, and they played videos and documentaries of their flattened cities, and many of the Russians believed that it was all fake. It reminded me of the propaganda that the United States believed about some of the justifications we heard for the war in Iraq.
Ukrainian soldiers are not touched these monuments to local soldiers who fall, but in the case of the Russian army on occupied territories, we have opposite situation.
So they come and they desecrate your monuments?
Yes, like that.
This is just my personal belief here, but I think there were a lot of lies about weapons of mass destruction that convinced the nation to invade. At the same time, this isn't surprising to me. Most of these Russian people here in Kursk are elderly, poor, and uneducated. Their lives are entirely focused on making ends meet, not learning about the intricacies of geopolitics of wars. These people are likely not a good representation of what most Russians believe. Still, it does give us important insight, because many of the Russian soldiers who are fighting on the front lines come from similar poor regions. This is well documented in Mediazona's reports, as it often is the case that in war it's the downtrodden part of society who are asked to fight and sacrifice the most. My fixer, though, he became angry. He heard the Russian civilians talking about how hard life was since the start of the war in August. He told her, the war didn't start in August. It's been going on far longer than that. I asked and found out that Ukrainian forces claim to have requested a humanitarian corridor multiple times from Russia so that the Russian civilians could be returned safely to Russian territory. But the requests were repeatedly denied by Moscow. From a cold, military calculated point of view, I could understand probably why. Authorizing a humanitarian corridor means a ceasefire, and a ceasefire in turn means it gives your adversary time to dig in deeper. The reality of defending Russian advances that outnumber them in Kursk means that Ukrainian troops have had to adapt their tactics and rely heavily on mobility to cover vast areas of contested ground. To solve for this problem, Ukraine has turned to the Stryker armored fighting vehicle. When I spoke to the commander of the vehicle, he revealed that there are some downsides to the Stryker that he wished was improved.
Compared to the BTR, it's very finicky, so the tires, the run flats are really great. They'll get you back to base and it's very survivable, but the problem is that the vehicle's tires are constantly needing to be replaced. They also say that they're constantly needing to go into the shop and get things fixed for the vehicle, and that it's hard to get Western parts here, and that they need more spare parts in order to continue their mission effectively a lot of times.
It felt great to be back in a Stryker. I felt a little bit like I was living vicariously through these guys. Sometimes you miss being in war, even though it's traumatic and awful and you don't want to be there. There's aspects of it that you miss, like the camaraderie, the equipment, the gear. But for some reason, Ukraine, it felt different being there. It didn't feel as traumatic because it really did feel like this was a justified cause.
There's also a feature where we have to take it off ourselves, because this space is useful for putting mines, so they can grab them quickly when they need to secure a perimeter. It's nice, that it's out of the way, because all they hold in their hands are a rucksack and their weapon.
They've done some interesting missions with like dropping off landmines, something that I hadn't pictured for the Stryker before, where they go into open fields and they've just dropped off tons of landmines to prevent Russians from advancing.
Would he prefer a Stryker or a Soviet BTR?
Every vehicle is different, but when it comes to speed and armor, of course I prefer the Stryker. But Strykers weren't made for the combat that we are in, like moving through woods. Sometimes the side can hit some branches and get jammed, and then I have to get out to get the ammunition out, or fix up the remote weapon station. So I just don't think the Stryker was made for these conditions. It was more made for open areas of combat. I do like the aiming computer module, and the Browning. Mostly we use the remote weapon station, because the eye doesn't have the same focus as a camera does, so it would be harder to hit the target. With the weapon camera, I can see their heat signature, and I'm able to see a vehicle from 1.5 kilometers, like it was only 100 meters from me, and I can see where my round hits, and I can also adjust my shooting a bit. Also, the Browning is pretty good as far as servicing. It only requires some cleanliness and oil. If you clean it and put some oil, it'll work without any flaws. Only negative side, it has a small belt of 200 rounds, and it's only enough for 1 minute for combat, and sometimes would be nice if it had more.
I came here to learn, but here's something I could actually help them with. I sent the unit instructions on how to fix that problem. There's a trick that you can do to increase your ammo capacity on the Stryker to 500 rounds, twice the amount, by welding 2 ammo cans together. According to the leadership in their unit that I spoke to, 6 of their Strykers were seriously damaged by direct hits from drones, and no soldiers were seriously injured in those strikes. For one, the thermal camera and weapon station are knocked offline very easily, even by the smallest amount of shrapnel or too much mud and dust, and having to get out from under the protection of armor to reload isn't really an option in this war. I learned that the way casualty evacuations work in Kursk is there's a stabilization point located away from the front where they focus on stopping the bleeding. This is like a level 2 trauma care equivalent in the US military. Once that's achieved, the casualties move to something closer to the equivalent of like a level 3 or 4 care, which would be an actual civilian hospital. But the battle in Ukraine isn't just a fight between ideology of the East and West, it's also a fight against tank design philosophy of the East and West. And Kursk has turned into a proving ground for these machines. Among them, the M1 Abrams is a symbol of Western military aid, which has taken center stage, but not without controversy.
We're here at a nondescript location in the middle of nowhere, Ukraine, where I'm with the Abrams units that are back from the front line. They're refitting, getting their Abrams fixed. Can you walk me through the day in the life, what your typical routine day looks like as an Abrams crew member?
There's a lot of enemy vehicles in the Kursk direction right now. We are fighting at a distance of 2 to 3 kilometers now. Well, it's also the case that we shoot infantry in the tree lines. We can arrive at a point when the enemy is 150 to 200 meters away from us. Whatever the order is, we work accordingly.
What can you tell me about the combat operations in Kursk?
We received those tanks from the start, without uranium armor, and it happened that enemy shots burned right through our frontal armor, and we were losing people because of that. But right now, on our own initiative, we hung extra armor. After that, the survivability of the crew and the armor itself improved. It would be great if we had uranium armor as well, so we survive as best we can.
When talking to all the different armored crews across the front line, it sounds like vehicles need to be rotated away from combat every couple of weeks for refit and repairs, routine maintenance, regardless. The Abrams just have to go through this extra step of having filters replaced, and they don't have all the diagnostic equipment that they need. Inside Kursk, I loaded back into the vehicle. We prepared to make a final stop. The driver of our vehicle wasn't an ordinary driver. He was from Ukrainian intelligence. They're responsible for my safety, and they made the call that we needed to exfil and we needed to do it now. And they were acting on an abundance of caution to get me out of there. The next day, Putin ordered for the use of new weapons against Ukraine, retaliation for the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. Initially, some analysts believed it was The first use of an ICBM with multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles that struck the city of Dnipro, where I had been staying only a few nights prior. It felt like this was one of the pivotal moments in the war, where the actions made over the next few months by these people I had met would chart the future of this region and potentially Europe.
What specific conditions does Ukraine seek to get out of a peace agreement? Do you need security guarantees? What would that security guarantee look like? Would it be European troops guaranteeing it?
What will happen next? Look, the Russian Federation is a classic authoritarian country with a very rigid Putin-esque vertical leadership structure. There are no political rivals or free speech here. They're authoritarian, and they want to wage war. They have a demarcation line. They will continue to create an image of the United States as a key enemy. And this will be the start of Cold War 2.0, because an undefeated Russia will be joined by not only North Korea and Iran, but a lot of other countries with similar political systems. To bring this war to a just conclusion, to bring Russia to justice, to ensure that Russia will pay out reparations for decades to come, and to rebuild what has been destroyed. This country will no longer be dominant, at nothing, nowhere, and no longer. Other potentially aggressive countries will look at the fate of the Russian Federation. What conclusion will they come to? Be afraid of America? Be afraid of democracy? Never break international law? Why would we refuse the only viable scenario?
Get back in.
They said go out because it will explode now. Да, прямо давайте ехать. Прямо.
It was time, due to the security situation, it was time for me to get the heck out of Kursk. As we gunned it through Kursk, I saw foreshadowing of what was on the horizon here. My journey back west had begun. It was 4 hours to Kyiv, where I would hop onto a train and take an 18-hour train ride to Warsaw, Poland. Due to the war, there are no flights in or out of Ukraine. The further west, away from Russia I traveled, there was a noticeable shift, a clear difference that stood out to me. We increasingly passed enormous defensive fortifications. I saw large trenches, pillboxes, dragon's teeth, and razor wire. Ukrainian construction equipment was everywhere, and these defensive lines showed signs of being recently built within the past few months. I observed multiple layers of these new defensive fortifications, preparing for a future fight in the Sumy direction if it were ever to come. The prosperity of the West stood in stark contrast to Russia. By the time I entered Poland, most all the houses and buildings had been renovated and given a new coat of paint. When I deployed to Iraq, I went into it thinking this was a just war. We're helping the people gain freedom from Saddam. But I learned pretty quickly this is not what people really wanted. And I had to go to Iraq to learn that. I had to go on the ground and experience it in order to really truly understand it. Before going to Ukraine, I was worried I was going to have a very similar experience, where I was going to meet a bunch of undisciplined, unsquared away soldiers who did not want to be there, and I thought I might be let down by what I thought the war was compared to what it actually was. Just like in Iraq. My travels through Ukraine, speaking with the people here could not have been more different of an experience. These people want the help. They want their sovereignty from Russia, and they're willing to pay a high price for it in blood. They want to associate and partner with Europe, because they can clearly see the prosperity that it affords those nations. However, from Russia's point of view, allowing Ukraine to freely associate is not a luxury they can be allowed to have. From Russia's point of view, destroying their statehood and absorbing Ukraine would be a massive boom for their prosperity. And from their historical view, Ukraine was never really a nation anyway. One of the most frequently asked questions that I get since I've gotten back from Ukraine is, do I think we should continue pouring money and weapons into this country? No, I don't think we should endlessly drip feed them money and equipment forever. No, I don't think we should endlessly drip feed them money and equipment into eternity. This is the worst of all possible worlds, except for maybe some in the military-industrial complex. We should give them what they need now to end this war on favorable terms for them and reach a ceasefire as quickly as possible to stop the dying and stop the waste of resources. Personally, and this is just my personal thoughts, I believe we should give them what they require now to stop Russia from advancing, so that Moscow doesn't assess that they can continue to gain leverage by pressing forward, to stop the suffering, to stop the dying, and to start the process of rebuilding. I have some more final thoughts, but first I need to give a huge thanks to my amazing wife, Caitlin, who was extremely supportive throughout this entire really, really difficult process. And I love you, Caitlin, and thank you so much for believing in me and trusting me. And I also huge thank you to 511 Tactical Gear, because they gave me all the equipment you see, like the plate carrier, my boots that were like amazing for the mud there. Honestly, cannot thank 511 enough for the help that they gave me. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for all your help and support through this. I love you guys. United 24 Media, who they're an outstanding organization that I really recommend you go and subscribe to them. And I need to thank you guys, because I never would have had this opportunity to do this without you, because I know if you're anything like me, you want to know what's really happening there. And so I thought you guys would appreciate this. So I hope you did. I hope I did right by you. A huge thank you to our creative producer, editor, just all around outstanding coworker, Michael. I owe a lot to his contributions to this. Also, thank you, Augie, who did a lot of the voiceover narrations for the translations. Thank you to everyone who helped with translating the different interviews. There's just everyone and anyone who I might have not mentioned. Thank you for being on the team and making this possible. Huge thanks to Odoo. I really appreciate the support that you guys gave me on my journey through Ukraine and to help manage tasks while I was away. And now you guys in the Spare Parts Army can show support for me and Odoo in return by creating your own account by clicking the link in the description. It's super easy, and scooping up your first application is free for life. So get your productivity supercharged by signing up today.